There are places that were never meant to disappear, but somehow they did. Stone cities built on hills, structures carved into cliffs, entrances that still stand, but led nowhere. And the strange part is, they don't feel destroyed, they feel left. In this video, we're exploring ancient sites that still hold their shape, their design, and their presence, but not the full story behind them. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. And if this kind of quiet mystery helps you slow down, make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to see is history that never fully explained itself. The circular pyramid buried beneath lava, Quiquilco. Long before the modern city expanded across this region, there was a structure that rose from the land in a form that feels unfamiliar even today. Not stepped in the way pyramids are often expected to be, not sharply angled or towering in layers, but circular, wide, grounded, and built in a way that feels deliberate, yet different. This is Quiquilco, and what makes it stand out is not only its shape, but what happened to it, because unlike many ancient structures that slowly faded over time, this one was buried suddenly, covered by volcanic lava that sealed parts of it beneath the surface, and that changes how the site is understood. The pyramid is circular in form, expanding outward rather than rising sharply upward, creating a structure that feels stable, low, and broad, emphasizing width over height. And that design matters, because it shifts focus. The base is wide, layered with stone and earth, forming a platform that gradually rises toward the center, creating a slope that is consistent rather than stepped in sharp levels. And that slope reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was designed to be ascended differently. The surface of the pyramid would have been accessible, not through narrow stairways alone, but across a gradual incline, suggesting that movement across it was part of its function. And that movement adds meaning, because it shapes how the structure is experienced. The materials used are consistent with the surrounding environment. Stone, earth, combine to create a structure that integrates with the land rather than standing apart from it. And that integration reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with available resources. What sets Quiquilco apart is the volcanic layer, a flow of lava that covered large portions of the site, preserving some areas while obscuring others, creating a contrast between what is visible and what remains hidden. And that preservation is important, because it freezes a moment in time. The eruption that buried the site was sudden, not gradual, covering the surrounding area in a way that halted activity, leaving behind structures that were not dismantled or abandoned over time but interrupted. And that interruption changes everything, because it preserves context. The surrounding settlement that once existed around the pyramid is only partially visible today. Fragments of structures, foundations, indicating that the pyramid was not isolated but part of a larger system, and that connection adds depth, because it shows that the structure functioned within a community. The circular form of the pyramid is unusual, because it differs from the more common angular or rectangular design seen in other regions, suggesting that the builders followed a different approach. And that difference creates curiosity, because it stands apart. The effort required to construct such a structure would have been significant. Material gathered, layered, shaped into a consistent form that maintains balance across its entire surface, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the design was sustained. The alignment of the pyramid within the landscape suggests that its position was not random, placed deliberately, connected to the surrounding terrain in a way that integrates it into the environment, and that placement reflects awareness, because it shows that location mattered. The lava that now surrounds parts of the site creates a visual contrast, dark, solid, encasing portions of the structure, making the boundary between natural formation and constructed form clearly visible. And that contrast adds impact, because it shows the interaction between nature and construction. The purpose of the pyramid is not fully defined. While it clearly served as a central structure, the exact activities that took place upon it are not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The preservation of the site beneath volcanic material has protected certain elements while concealing others, creating a partial record that can be studied but not fully reconstructed. And that limitation adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. Even now, Quiquilco remains, its circular form still visible, its structure still intact in parts, allowing the design to be understood despite the layers that cover it, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is contrast, a constructed form, interrupted by natural force, a structure that was not dismantled, but buried, a design that expands outward, held in place beneath layers of volcanic stone, and that combination creates something different, because it is not just a pyramid, it is a structure preserved through interruption, a moment sealed beneath lava, a form that still holds its shape, even when part of it remains hidden, and that presence, the hilltop settlements that were built to overlook everything, El Argar. Across uneven terrain, where hills rise sharply above the surrounding land, there are settlements positioned in places that feel chosen rather than convenient. Not close to water, not hidden in valleys, but placed high, visible, exposed, and deliberately elevated. These are the hilltop settlements of El Argar, and what makes them stand out is not just their location, but how consistently they appear on elevated ground, because instead of spreading across open land, these settlements were built on heights that overlook the surrounding landscape, creating spaces that feel controlled from above. And that changes how the site is understood. The elevation's immediate, steep slopes leading upward to flattened areas where structures were built, indicating that the land was shaped to support habitation. And that shaping matters, because it shows that the terrain was modified, the settlements are compact, not widely spread, structures placed close together, forming dense arrangements that maximize the limited space available at the top of the hill, and that density reflects planning, because it shows that space was used efficiently. The walls are built from stone, thick enough to define boundaries, forming enclosures that create separation between interior and exterior spaces, and that separation adds structure, because it organizes the layout. The positioning of these walls follows the contours of the hill, curving, adjusting, indicating that the builders worked with the slope rather than forcing a rigid design onto it. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the land shaped the settlement. The pathways between structures are narrow, defined by the arrangement of walls, guiding movement through the settlement in a controlled way rather than allowing open access. And that control matters, because it directs flow. The elevation provides visibility, wide views across the surrounding terrain, allowing movement beyond the settlement to be observed from a distance. And that visibility adds purpose, because it shows that location was strategic. The structures themselves are simple in form, rectangular or slightly irregular spaces defined by stone walls, creating interiors that are enclosed but functional. And that simplicity reflects practicality, because it supports daily use. One of the most distinct aspects of these settlements is how integrated they are with the hill, because instead of flattening the land completely, the builders used terraces, creating levels that step along the slope, forming a layered layout. And that layering adds depth, because it shows that the design responds to elevation. The effort required to build in such locations would have been significant. Materials transported upward, stone placed carefully to maintain stability on uneven ground, a process that requires control and persistence. And that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the location was worth the difficulty. The arrangement of the settlements suggests organization, structures placed in relation to each other, forming a layout that supports movement, activity, and connection within a limited space. And that organization reflects planning, because it shows that the settlement was designed. The elevated position also creates separation, because access to the settlement requires ascent, limiting entry points and creating a natural form of control, and that separation adds function, because it defines who can enter. The presence of storage spaces, living areas, and enclosed sections suggests that these settlements were not temporary, but established locations used over time, and that permanence adds meaning, because it shows that the site was sustained. The materials used are consistent across the settlement. Local stone, shaped and placed to form walls and terraces, creating a unified appearance that connects the entire site. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the method was understood. The purpose of building on such elevated ground is often associated with visibility and protection, but the exact reasons behind the consistent placement across multiple sites are not fully defined. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. Even now, the remains of El Argar settlements are visible, their walls still marking space, their terraces still defining levels across the hills, allowing the structure of the settlements to be understood despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines these sites is elevation, not just height, but perspective, a way of building that places the settlement above the landscape, creating a relationship between structure and visibility that shapes how the space functions. Stone walls following the slope, terraces, stepping across the hill, paths that guide movement upward, and a layout that looks outward as much as inward. And maybe that is what makes El Argar stand out, not just because of where it is built, but because of how it uses height, creating settlements that are not hidden within the land but placed above it, forming spaces that observe, define, and control their surroundings. A settlement on a rise, a structure shaped by slope, a design that looks outward, and that elevation. The circular stone houses that formed a complete living system, Kirakitia. On a slope overlooking a river, there is a settlement that doesn't immediately stand out because of size or height, but because of how everything fits together. Not isolated structures, not scattered remains, but a system, layered, connected, and still readable. This is Kirakitia, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of stone houses, but how those houses are arranged, because instead of being placed randomly, they form a structured layout that reflects how people lived, moved, and interacted within a defined space. And that changes everything. The houses are circular, built from stone, forming enclosed units that define individual spaces, each one shaped consistently, creating a pattern that repeats across the settlement. And that repetition matters, because it shows that the design was shared. The walls of these houses are thick, constructed from stacked stone, forming boundaries that support weight while creating enclosed interiors, indicating that stability was a key part of the design, and that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders worked with structure. The entrances are small, controlled openings that lead into the interior, suggesting that access to each space was defined rather than open, and that control adds purpose, because it shapes how the space is used. Inside, the houses are compact, not large, but sufficient, creating interiors that are functional without excess, indicating that the space was used efficiently. And that efficiency reflects planning, because it shows that the design was intentional. The arrangement of the houses is dense, placed close together, forming clusters that create a network of structures rather than isolated units. And that density adds connection, because it shows that the settlement was communal. The pathways between houses are narrow, defined by the positioning of walls, guiding movement through the settlement in a controlled way rather than allowing open, unrestricted space. And that flow reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was considered. One of the most defining aspects of Kirakitia is how the settlement is enclosed. Stone walls surround the area, creating a boundary that separates the interior from the surrounding landscape. And that boundary matters, because it defines the settlement as a contained space. The positioning of the settlement on a slope adds another layer, because the houses are built along the incline, creating levels that step upward, forming a layout that follows the terrain rather than reshaping it completely. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the land influenced the design. The materials used are consistent, local stone gathered and shaped to form walls, creating a unified appearance across the entire settlement. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the method was understood. The effort required to build such a settlement would have been sustained, stone collected, placed carefully, structures built close together, forming a system that grows over time rather than appearing all at once. And that effort reflects continuity, because it shows that the settlement developed. The circular design of the houses creates a pattern, a visual rhythm that defines the site, making it distinct from settlements built with rectangular or angular forms, and that pattern adds identity, because it shows that the design follows a consistent approach. The purpose of these houses is clear in function: spaces for living, shelter. But the full details of daily life within them are not completely preserved, and that limitation adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The connection between the houses suggests interaction, because their proximity allows movement between them, forming a network that supports community, and that connection reflects structure, because it shows that the settlement operates as a whole. Even now, Kirokitia remains, its circular foundation still visible, its layout still intact, allowing the structure of the settlement to be understood through what remains, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is cohesion, not just individual houses, but how they come together, a series of circles, connected through placement, forming a system that reflects both structure and life. And that combination creates something more than a collection of buildings. It creates a settlement, a layout that shows how space was used, how movement was guided, how life was organised within stone. And maybe that is what makes Kirokitia stand out, not just because of its houses, but because of how those houses connect, forming a complete system that still holds its shape, even after everything else has faded. Circular walls, narrow paths, a settlement built as one, and that system, the rock shrines carved into the quarry walls, Gebel el Silsila. Along a narrow stretch where the river cuts between rising cliffs, there is a place where the stone itself has been shaped, not into buildings placed on the land, but into spaces carved directly into it. From a distance, the cliffs feel natural, layered rock, rough surfaces, a landscape defined by erosion and time. But as you move closer, the details begin to change. Flat faces, straight edges, openings that don't belong to nature, and that's where the structure begins to appear. This is Gebel el Silsila. And what makes it stand out is not just the quarry itself, but the shrines carved into the rock walls, because this is a place where extraction and creation exist side by side, where the same stone that was removed to build elsewhere was also shaped into spaces that remain here. And that changes how the site is understood. The cliffs are steep, rising vertically from the ground, forming a natural boundary that encloses the space, creating a setting that feels contained even without constructed walls. And that enclosure matters, because it defines the environment. The quarry marks are visible, cuts in the stone, sections where material was removed, leaving behind surfaces that show the process of extraction, indicating that this was a place of sustained activity, and that activity reflects purpose, because it shows that the site was used. Within these quarry walls, the shrines are carved, not added, not assembled, but shaped directly into the rock, creating interior spaces that exist within the cliff itself. And that method reflects a different approach, because it shows that the structure is part of the landscape. The entrances to these shrines are defined, rectangular openings cut into the rock, creating clear access points that lead into enclosed chambers, and that definition matters, because it shows that the design was controlled. Inside, the chambers are contained. Stone walls on all sides, ceilings formed from the same material, creating a continuous surface that defines the interior, and that continuity reflects stability, because it shows that the structure is unified. The surfaces within the shrines are shaped, smoothed compared to the outer rock, indicating that effort was applied to create a defined interior rather than leaving the space rough, and that shaping reflects intention, because it shows that the space was prepared. The placement of these shrines within the quarry suggests connection, because they are not isolated structures, but part of the same environment where stone was removed, indicating that the site served multiple functions, and that combination adds complexity, because it shows that the space was used in different ways. The alignment of the shrines along the rock face suggests planning, not random placement, but positioning that follows a pattern, creating a sequence of spaces along the cliff. And that pattern reflects organisation, because it shows that the layout was considered. The effort required to carve these spaces would have been significant. Stone removed gradually, chambers shaped over time, a process that requires control and persistence rather than speed. And that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the result mattered. The relationship between the shrines and the river adds another layer, because the site is positioned along a waterway, creating access and connection to movement beyond the cliffs. And that placement reflects awareness, because it shows that location was chosen. The purpose of these shrines is not fully defined. While their form suggests spaces of significance, the exact activities that took place within them are not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The contrast between extraction and carving defines the site, because stone is both removed and shaped, creating a balance between absence and presence. And that contrast adds meaning, because it shows how the material is used. Even now the shrines remain, their openings still visible, their interiors still accessible, allowing the structure to be experienced directly within the rock, and that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines Gebel el-Silsila is integration. Not structures placed onto the land, but spaces carved into it. A quarry that becomes a series of chambers, a landscape shaped into form, a place where removal creates structure, and that approach changes how the site is understood, because it is not built in the usual way. It is revealed, stone cut away, space created within, a structure that exists inside the cliff, and that transformation. The fortified hilltop city with 2 gates, Khirbet Kayafa. On a hill that overlooks the surrounding valley, there is a site where the boundaries are still clearly defined, even after time has removed much of what once stood inside them. From a distance it feels contained, a raised area, stone outlining its edges, a shape that separates itself from the land below. But as you move closer, the structure becomes more precise. Walls, entrances, a layout that still holds its form. This is Khirbet Kayafa, and what makes it stand out is not just its elevated position, but how clearly its fortifications remain visible, because the city is enclosed by a continuous stone wall that defines its perimeter almost completely. And that changes how the site is understood. The walls are thick, constructed from large stones placed together to form a boundary that surrounds the settlement, creating a clear distinction between interior and exterior space. And that boundary matters, because it defines control. The shape of the city follows the contour of the hill, not perfectly circular, not rigidly rectangular, but adjusted to the terrain, indicating that the builders adapted the design to the land rather than forcing a fixed form. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the terrain influenced the structure. One of the most defining features of the site is the presence of 2 gates, openings in the wall that serve as controlled entry points, allowing movement into and out of the settlement. And that detail is significant, because it is uncommon. The placement of these gates suggests planning, positioned to connect with pathways beyond the walls, indicating that access was not random but directed. And that direction reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was considered. The entrances themselves are defined, structured openings that interrupt the continuity of the wall, creating points of transition between outside and inside. And that transition matters, because it shapes how the space is entered. Inside the walls, the layout becomes more detailed, structures arranged along the interior edge, rooms connected to the wall itself, forming a pattern that integrates habitation with fortification. And that integration adds complexity, because it shows that the walls were part of daily life. The buildings are constructed from stone, simple in form, but placed in a way that creates enclosed spaces for activity, suggesting that the interior supported sustained use. And that functionality reflects purpose, because it shows that the site was inhabited. The pathways within the settlement are narrow, guided by the placement of walls and structures, creating movement that follows defined routes rather than open space. And that flow reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was controlled. The elevated position provides visibility, wide views across the valley allowing activity beyond the settlement to be observed from a distance. And that visibility adds function, because it shows that the site was aware of its surroundings. The effort required to construct such fortifications would have been significant. Stone gathered, transported, placed carefully to create walls that maintain stability across uneven terrain. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the project was sustained. The use of a continuous wall creates cohesion, because the entire settlement is enclosed within a single boundary, forming a unified structure rather than separate parts. And that cohesion reflects design, because it shows that the site was planned as a whole. The presence of 2 gates raises questions, because while they clearly serve as entry points, the reason for having more than one is not fully defined. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The relationship between the walls and the interior structures suggests efficiency, because the same stone forms both protection and habitation, creating a system that uses material in multiple ways. And that efficiency reflects understanding, because it shows that the design is practical. Even now, Khirbet Qeiyafa remains, its walls still outlining the settlement, its gates still marking entry points, allowing the structure to be understood clearly through what remains, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is clarity, a boundary that is still visible, a layout that is still readable, a structure that still holds its form, and that clarity makes it different, because it allows the settlement to be seen not just as ruins, but as a complete system. Walls that define space, gates that control access, structures that connect to the boundary, and a design that brings everything together. And maybe that is what makes Khirbet Qeiyafa stand out. Not just because it is fortified, but because of how clearly that fortification remains, a structure that still shows its purpose through its form, a city on a hill, enclosed in stone, defined by its edges, and that structure, the coastal port that once connected distant worlds, Adulis. Along a stretch of coastline where land meets open water, there is a place that no longer looks like a port, but still carries the outline of one. The shore feels quiet now, open, undisturbed, with only fragments of stone and subtle changes in the terrain hinting that something once stood here. But this was not an empty place. This was a connection point, a meeting of roots, a space where movement arrived from far beyond the horizon. This is Adulis, and what makes it stand out is not just that it was a port, but how significant it appears to have been, because this site once linked inland regions with distant shores, forming a network that extended far beyond what is visible today, and that changes how the site is understood. The position of Adulis is strategic, located along the coast, where access to the sea allows movement in and out of the region, creating a connection between land-based routes and maritime travel, and that positioning matters, because it defines function. The shoreline here would have supported activity, ships arriving, goods being transferred, movement that connects different regions through a single point. And that activity reflects purpose, because it shows that the site was active. The remains at the site suggest structures, foundations, stone outlines that indicate buildings once stood here, forming a settlement that supported the function of the port, and that structure adds depth, because it shows that the site was organised. The layout of these remains is not fully preserved, but enough exists to indicate that the settlement was arranged in a way that supports movement between spaces, suggesting pathways, storage areas, and areas of activity. And that organisation reflects planning, because it shows that the port was structured. The materials used are consistent with the environment, stone gathered locally, shaped and placed to form, buildings that could withstand coastal conditions, and that consistency reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with the surroundings. The connection between land and sea is what defines Adulis, because the site exists at the point where inland movement meets open water, creating a transition between different types of travel, and that transition adds meaning, because it shows that the site connects systems. The scale of activity that once took place here would have been significant, not isolated, but continuous, with movement arriving and departing, indicating that the port functioned as part of a larger network. And that scale reflects importance, because it shows that the site was not minor. The effort required to maintain such a port would have been sustained. Structures built, maintained, adapted over time to support ongoing use, and that effort reflects continuity, because it shows that the site was active for an extended period. What sets Adulis apart is how little remains above the surface compared to its former role. Because while it once connected distant regions, the visible structures today are limited, creating a contrast between its past importance and present condition. And that contrast adds mystery, because it leaves gaps. The disappearance of much of the site suggests change, environmental shifts, possible abandonment, processes that gradually altered the landscape, reducing what is visible today. And that transformation adds depth, because it shows that the site evolved. The relationship between the port and inland routes suggests that goods moved through this space, arriving from the sea, continuing across land, creating a flow that connects different environments, and that flow reflects integration, because it shows that the site was part of a system. The absence of complete structures makes interpretation more difficult, because while the foundations indicate presence, the full extent of the port is not entirely visible. And that limitation adds uncertainty, because it leaves questions unanswered. Even now, Adulis remains, its position unchanged, its connection to the coastline still clear, even if the structures that once defined it are no longer fully intact, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is connection, not just between land and sea, but between places far beyond the horizon. A port that once held movement, a space where routes met, a location that linked distant regions through a single point, and now, a place where that activity is no longer visible, but still suggested by what remains. Stone foundations, open shoreline, a quiet landscape that once carried motion, and that contrast. The cliffside structures built into the face of the escarpment, Bandiagara. Along a vast stretch of land where the ground suddenly rises into a long wall of stone, there is a landscape that feels divided into two levels, above and below, and between them, something unexpected. From a distance, the cliffs appear natural, a continuous escarpment stretching across the horizon, steep, unbroken. But as you look closer, the surface begins to change. Openings, shapes, structures that don't follow the randomness of erosion. And that's where the difference becomes clear. This is the Bandiagara escarpment, and what makes it stand out is not just the scale of the cliff itself, but the presence of structures built directly into its face, because instead of settling only on the ground or at the top, these constructions occupy the vertical space of the rock. And that changes everything. The escarpment is steep, rising sharply from the surrounding land, creating a natural barrier that defines the landscape, forming a boundary that is both visible and difficult to cross. And that elevation matters, because it creates separation. The structures are positioned along the cliff face, embedded into the rock, placed in locations that appear difficult to reach, suggesting that access was controlled or limited, and that placement reflects intention, because it shows that the location was chosen deliberately. These structures are built from materials that match the environment. Stone, earth, shaped and placed to form enclosed spaces that blend into the cliff, making them part of the rock rather than separate from it. And that integration reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with the terrain. The openings of these structures are small, defined, creating entrances that lead into interior spaces carved or built into the rock, forming chambers that are protected by the cliff itself. And that protection adds purpose, because it shows that the location offers security. The vertical arrangement of the structures creates layers, some positioned higher, others lower, forming a system that occupies different levels of the cliff, and that layering adds complexity, because it shows that the space is used in more than one way. The effort required to build in such locations would have been significant. Materials transported, placed carefully in positions that require precision, creating structures that maintain stability despite their placement. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the construction was deliberate. The relationship between the structures and the ground below suggests connection, because while the cliff holds the buildings, the land beneath supports movement and activity, creating a link between vertical and horizontal space, and that connection reflects integration, because it shows that the site functions as a whole. The positioning of the structures offers visibility. From the cliff, the surrounding landscape can be observed, creating an advantage in awareness that is not available from the ground alone, and that visibility adds function, because it shows that the location provides perspective. The arrangement of the structures is not random. They follow the shape of the cliff, adapting to its contours, creating a layout that responds to the natural form rather than imposing a rigid design. And that adaptation reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders used the rock itself as part of the structure. The purpose of these cliffside constructions is not fully defined, because while they clearly served as enclosed spaces, the exact nature of their use varies and is not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The contrast between the natural cliff and the constructed elements is subtle, because the materials are similar, making the structures appear as extensions of the rock rather than additions, and that subtlety adds impact, because it shows how closely the construction follows the environment. Even now the structures remain, visible along the cliff face, their shapes still defined, allowing the arrangement to be understood despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines the Bandiagara escarpment is verticality, not just height, but how that height is used, a landscape that rises, and structures that occupy that rise, a system that exists between ground and sky, built into the stone itself, and that approach changes how the site is experienced, because it is not spread across the land, it is embedded within it. Cliff walls holding space, structures placed within rock, a settlement that moves upward instead of outward, and maybe that is what makes Bandiagara stand out, not just because of its scale, but because of how that scale is used, creating a space that exists along the face of the earth rather than on top of it, a vertical settlement, integrated into stone, defined by height, and that presence, the massive stone gateway that stands alone, Ha'amonga, a Maui trilithon. In an open coastal landscape, where the land stretches quietly toward the horizon, there is a structure that stands with a presence that feels both simple and deliberate, not part of a larger complex, not surrounded by walls or buildings, just 3 stones, positioned, balanced, and still standing. This is the Ha'amonga, a Maui trilithon, and what makes it stand out is not just its form, but its scale, because 2 vertical stones support a single horizontal block above them, creating a gateway-like structure that appears stable despite the weight it holds. And that changes how the structure is understood. The vertical stones are massive, standing upright, positioned firmly in the ground, creating support points that hold the structure in place. And that stability matters, because it carries the weight. The horizontal stone rests across the top, aligned carefully with the vertical supports, forming a continuous structure that depends on balance rather than additional reinforcement, and that balance reflects understanding, because it shows that placement was precise. The stones are large, heavy, requiring effort to position, indicating that the structure was not accidental but the result of sustained work, and that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was meant to exist. The spacing between the vertical stones creates an opening, a passage, defining a space beneath the horizontal block, suggesting that movement through the structure was part of its function, and that opening adds meaning, because it shapes interaction. The simplicity of the design is striking, only 3 stones, no additional elements, yet the structure remains visually strong, creating a presence that stands out against the surrounding landscape, and that simplicity adds impact, because it shows that minimal elements can define space. The alignment of the structure within the landscape suggests that its placement was not random, positioned in a way that connects with the environment, indicating that location was considered, and that placement reflects awareness, because it shows that the structure interacts with its surroundings. The effort required to lift and position the horizontal stone would have been significant, because raising such a mass requires coordination, control, and a method that ensures balance once it is placed, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the process was organised. The absence of additional structures around the trilithon creates isolation, because the structure stands alone, making its presence more defined and focused, and that isolation adds emphasis, because it draws attention. The materials used are consistent with the environment, stone-shaped and placed to form a structure that remains stable despite exposure to weather and time, and that consistency reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with available resources. The purpose of the trilithon is not fully defined, because while it clearly forms a gateway-like structure, the exact reason for its construction and use is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The proportions of the structure are balanced, the vertical stones spaced evenly, the horizontal stone aligned across them, creating a form that feels stable and controlled, and that proportion reflects design, because it shows that the structure was measured. Even now the trilithon remains, its stones still standing, its shape still intact, allowing the structure to be understood clearly despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this structure is balance, not complexity, but precision, a form that depends on placement, a structure that holds together through alignment, three stones, working as one. And that simplicity creates something stronger than expected, because it shows that structure does not always require complexity. Sometimes it is defined by how elements come together, and maybe that is what makes the Harmonger a Maui trilithon stand out, not just because of its size, but because of how it holds itself, a structure that creates space using only three elements, arranged in a way that remains stable, visible, and deliberate. Two stones rising, one resting above, a passage formed beneath, and that balance. The hidden terraces carved into stone that still hold their precision, Sacsayhuaman. Above the surrounding valley, where the land rises into a broad, elevated ridge, there is a structure that doesn't immediately reveal how much of it exists beneath the surface. From a distance, it looks like massive stone walls, layered, angular, dominating the slope, but the closer you look, the more complex it becomes. Because these are not just walls, they are terraces, layered into the land itself. This is Sacsayhuaman, and what makes it stand out is not just the scale of its stonework, but how those stones are arranged to form terraced levels that follow the natural slope, creating a structure that is both part of the hill and separate from it. And that changes how the site is understood. The terraces are wide, stepped layers that rise one above the other, forming a sequence of levels that extend across the slope, creating a structure that expands horizontally as much as it rises vertically. And that layering matters, because it defines the system. The stones used are massive, irregular in shape, but fitted together with precision that creates joints so tight that the boundaries between them become difficult to see. And that precision reflects understanding, because it shows that each stone was shaped to fit. The walls formed by these stones are not flat. They move in a zigzag pattern, creating angles that shift across the structure, forming a layout that is both structured and dynamic, and that pattern adds complexity, because it shows that the design is not uniform. The terraces follow the contour of the land, not forcing a straight line, but adapting to the natural shape of the slope, indicating that the builders worked with the terrain rather than against it. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the environment shaped the design. The height of the walls varies across the terraces, some rising higher than others, creating a layered effect that enhances the sense of depth and scale within the structure. And that variation adds dimension, because it creates perspective. The surfaces of the stones are smooth, shaped, not left rough, but work to create faces that align with each other, forming walls that are both stable and visually consistent. And that shaping reflects effort, because it shows that the material was controlled. The terraces are not only structural, they also define space, creating levels that could support activity, movement, or other functions, suggesting that the structure was used rather than purely decorative, and that function adds meaning, because it shows that the terraces were part of a system. The effort required to build at this scale would have been significant. Stone transported, shaped, positioned with precision, a process that requires coordination over time rather than a single phase of construction. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the project was sustained. The alignment of the terraces suggests that they were positioned deliberately, not randomly placed, but arranged in a way that creates a consistent flow across the structure, guiding movement along the slope. And that flow reflects organization, because it shows that the layout was designed. What makes Sacsayhuaman particularly notable is how much of it is hidden, because while the visible terraces are large, the full extent of the structure extends beyond what can be immediately seen, suggesting that there are layers and elements that remain below or beyond the visible surface. And that hidden aspect adds depth, because it expands the structure beyond what is visible. The purpose of these terraces is not limited to a single explanation, because they combine elements of structure, space, and possibly defense, creating a system that serves multiple roles. And that combination adds complexity, because it shows that the structure is multifunctional. The relationship between the terraces and the surrounding landscape creates integration, because the structure does not stand apart from the hill, but becomes part of it, shaping the slope into defined levels. And that integration reflects design, because it shows that the structure and terrain are connected. Even now, Sacsayhuaman remains, its terraces still visible, its stonework still intact, allowing the structure to be understood through its form despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is precision, not just in the shaping of stone, but in the arrangement of space, a structure built from massive elements, fitted together without gaps, layered into the land, and extending beyond what is immediately visible. And that combination creates something different, because it is not just a series of walls, it is a system of terraces, a structure that shapes the slope, a design that balances weight, placement, and form. And maybe that is what makes Sacsayhuaman stand out, not just because of its scale, but because of how that scale is controlled, a structure that uses massive stones to create something precise, layered and enduring. Terraces rising from the hill, stones fitted without space, a structure that holds its form, and that precision, the elongated stone tomb built for a scale that feels larger than expected, Limizani. Across a quiet stretch of land, where the ground feels undisturbed and open, there is a structure that doesn't rise high, but extends outward in a way that feels deliberate. Not vertical, not enclosed in the usual sense, but long, defined, and shaped with intention. This is the Tomb of the Giants at Limizani, and what makes it stand out is not just that it is a burial structure, but how it is built, because instead of forming a compact chamber hidden beneath the ground, this tomb extends horizontally, creating a form that emphasizes length and presence across the landscape, and that changes how the structure is understood. The front of the tomb is marked by large stones, arranged to form a curved facade that frames the entrance, creating a shape that draws attention to the center, and that framing matters, because it defines the approach. At the center of this facade is the entrance, a narrow opening set within a larger stone slab, creating a contrast between scale and access. And that contrast is important, because it shapes perception. The entrance leads into a long internal chamber, enclosed, extending inward, forming a passage that continues through the structure, creating a space that is defined by its length rather than its width. And that extension reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was designed to stretch. The stones used are large, placed carefully to form walls that remain stable over time, creating a continuous enclosure that holds the interior space, and that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that the structure was built to endure. The alignment of the tomb is deliberate, positioned in relation to the surrounding landscape, suggesting that its orientation was chosen rather than accidental, and that placement adds meaning, because it shows that the structure connects to its environment. The scale of the tomb creates a presence, not through height but through length, forming a structure that occupies space across the ground, making it visible despite its low profile, and that presence matters, because it defines the site. The effort required to construct such a tomb would have been significant. Stone gathered, transported, positioned to form both the facade and the internal chamber, a process that requires coordination and time, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was intentional. The curved facade contrasts with the straight internal passage, creating a difference between exterior and interior, suggesting that the design includes both visual and functional elements. And that contrast adds depth, because it shows that the structure is layered. The purpose of the tomb is associated with burial, but the scale and design suggest that it may have held more significance than a simple resting place, indicating that the structure carries meaning beyond its function, and that meaning adds complexity, because it shows that the structure represents something larger. The name Tomb of the Giants reflects the impression created by the scale, not because of confirmed size of those buried within, but because of how the structure feels when experienced. And that perception matters, because it shapes interpretation. The placement of stones in the facade creates a visual boundary, a defined front that separates the tomb from the surrounding land, creating a transition between open space and enclosed interior. And that boundary reflects intention, because it shows that the entrance is marked. Even now, the tomb remains, its stones still in place, its shape still visible, allowing the structure to be understood despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines Limizani is scale, not height, but extension. A structure that moves across the land rather than rising above it. A tomb that defines space through length. A design that combines presence with containment. And that combination creates something different, because it is not hidden, it is visible, Not elevated, but extended. And maybe that is what makes this tomb stand out. Not just because of its purpose, but because of how it is built. A structure that emphasizes distance, guiding movement inward through a long, enclosed space that still holds its form. A curved facade, a narrow entrance, a chamber that stretches inward, and that extension. The stone structure shaped like a vessel turned into the ground, navetta d'étudiant. In a quiet stretch of land, where the surface feels open and undisturbed, there is a structure that doesn't immediately resemble a tomb, but something more shaped, more intentional in form. It doesn't rise sharply, it doesn't spread outward in layers. Instead, it curves, contained. Almost like an object placed onto the land rather than built from it. This is the navetta d'étudiants, and what makes it stand out is not just its function, but its shape, because the structure resembles an inverted vessel, built from stone in a form that feels both simple and controlled, creating a design that is distinct from other burial structures, and that changes how the site is understood. The exterior is curved, smooth in outline, formed from carefully placed stones that create a continuous surface, giving the structure a unified appearance, and that continuity matters, because it defines the form. The stones are stacked without mortar, placed in layers that gradually narrow as they rise, creating a shape that holds itself through balance and weight, rather than binding material. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows that the structure depends on placement. The entrance is small, low, set into the front of the structure, creating a controlled access point that leads into the interior, and that scale is important, because it shapes how the space is entered. Inside, the structure is divided. 2 levels, a lower chamber and an upper space, separated by stone, creating an interior that is more complex than the exterior suggests, and that division adds depth. Because it shows that the structure is layered, the lower chamber is enclosed, defined by stone walls that create a contained space, suggesting that it served a specific purpose within the structure, and that containment reflects function, because it shows that the space was used intentionally. The upper chamber, accessible within the structure, adds another dimension, because it creates vertical separation, indicating that the interior was not limited to a single space. And that layering reflects planning, because it shows that the design includes multiple levels. The effort required to construct such a structure would have been significant. Stone gathered, placed carefully in a way that maintains the curved form, ensuring stability as the structure rises, and that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the shape was deliberate, the materials used are consistent. Local stone shaped and positioned to create both the exterior form and the interior spaces, forming a structure that is unified in both appearance and construction. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the method was understood. The scale of the structure is moderate, large enough to stand out within the landscape but not overwhelming, creating a presence that is defined by form rather than size. And that balance matters, because it shapes perception. The absence of decorative elements focuses attention on the structure itself, because the form becomes the defining feature rather than added detail. And that simplicity adds clarity, because it highlights the design. The purpose of the navetta is associated with burial, but the design suggests that it may have held significance beyond function, creating a structure that carries both practical and symbolic meaning. And that meaning adds complexity, because it shows that the structure represents something. The preservation of the structure allows its form to be clearly understood, because the exterior remains largely intact, providing a complete outline that can be observed directly, and that clarity keeps it relevant. The relationship between exterior and interior creates contrast, a smooth, curved outer form, and a divided, enclosed interior, and that contrast defines the structure, because it shows that what is visible does not fully reveal what is inside. Even now, the navetta d'étudiant remains, its shape still distinct, its structure still intact, allowing it to stand as a complete form within the landscape, and that persistence keeps it present. What defines this structure is form, not height, not complexity, but shape. A design that curves inward, a structure that holds space within, a form that feels contained, balanced, and deliberate. And that design creates something different, because it does not rely on scale or decoration, it relies on structure, a vessel-like shape built from stone, an interior divided into layers, a presence defined by balance. And maybe that is what makes the Navetta des Tudons stand out, not just because of its purpose, but because of how it is built, a structure that transforms simple materials into a form that remains clear, stable, and recognizable. A curved exterior, a layered interior, a structure shaped with intention, and that form, the hilltop citadel built in layers of stone and elevation, La Quimada. Across a rugged stretch of land, where the ground rises unevenly into stone-covered hills, there is a site that doesn't appear as a single structure, but as a series of levels built into the slope itself. From a distance it looks fragmented. Stone scattered across elevation, walls that don't form a single outline, terraces that seem disconnected. But as you move through it, the system begins to reveal itself. Paths, platforms, boundaries that follow the land, and slowly the structure comes together. This is La Quimada, and what makes it stand out is not just its location, but how it was built in layers across the hill, because instead of creating a flat settlement, the builders used terraces and platforms to form a citadel that rises step by step with the terrain, and that changes how the site is understood. The elevation is central to the design. The site is positioned on a hill, creating a natural advantage in visibility and separation, allowing the structure to overlook the surrounding landscape. And that positioning matters, because it defines perspective. The terraces form the foundation of the site. Flat platforms carved or built into the slope, creating levels that support structures and movement, forming a layered system across the hill. And that layering reflects planning, because it shows that the land was shaped. The walls are constructed from stone, thick, strong, placed to define boundaries between different sections, creating enclosures that separate spaces within the citadel. And that separation adds structure, because it organises the layout. The pathways between terraces are defined, guiding movement upward and across the site, creating a flow that follows the elevation rather than ignoring it. And that flow reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was considered. Some of the structures within the site are elevated further, positioned on higher platforms, creating a hierarchy of space where certain areas stand above others. And that hierarchy adds meaning, because it shows that not all spaces were equal. The materials used are consistent. Local stone gathered and shaped to form walls, platforms and structures, creating a unified appearance across the entire site. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the builders worked with available resources. The effort required to construct such a citadel would have been significant. Stone transported, placed carefully on uneven ground, terraces formed to support additional construction, a process that requires coordination over time. And that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was sustained. The layout of La Quimada is not symmetrical. It follows the shape of the hill, adapting to the natural contours rather than imposing a rigid design. And that adaptation reflects awareness, because it shows that the terrain influenced the structure. The combination of terraces, walls, and elevated platforms creates a system, not isolated structures, but interconnected spaces that function together, forming a complete environment. And that system adds complexity, because it shows that the site was organised. The elevated position provides visibility across the surrounding land, allowing observation of movement beyond the site, creating a connection between the citadel and the landscape below. And that visibility adds function, because it shows that the site interacts with its surroundings. The purpose of La Quimada is not fully defined, because while its structure suggests defence, habitation, and organisation, the exact role of each part is not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The condition of the site today preserves much of its layout. Terraces still visible, walls still defining space, allowing the structure to be understood even without complete reconstruction, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines La Quimada is elevation, not just height, but how that height is used. A structure built in layers, a system that rises with the land, a design that turns slope into structure, and that approach creates something different, because it is not built on flat ground. It is built into elevation, terraces forming levels, walls defining boundaries, a citadel shaped by the hill itself. And maybe that is what makes La Quemada stand out, not just because of its position, but because of how it uses that position, creating a structure that grows upward through layers, forming a system that is both connected and controlled. Stone platforms rising step by step, paths guiding movement upward, a structure defined by its elevation, and that system